Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, the famous writer and the pretty Southern belle, glittering icons of the roaring 20s. They lived their lives with wild abandon and were hailed as king and queen of the jazz age. But the good times didn't last. By 40, Fitzgerald was washed up, an alcoholic, his books no longer in print, his name forgotten, and his glamorous wife locked away in an insane asylum. Fitzgerald's rise and fall was dramatic, even shocking. But as he once wrote, "Give me a hero, and I'll write you a tragedy." It was the story of his life, the story of a great American dreamer. The start of the 20th century was an exciting time in America as the Industrial Revolution gave way to a more modern era. The country was alive with new forms of transportation and communication, and a new hope for the future. Like many Americans born near the turn of the century, Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald had great hopes and aspirations. He wanted to be a rich and famous writer, admired the world over. This was a big goal for a little Irish Catholic boy who was born on September 24, 1896, in the small Midwestern town of St. Paul, Minnesota. Named after Francis Scott Key, a distant relation who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, young Scott was his parents' pride and joy. His father, Edward Fitzgerald, doted on his young son, teaching him all the finer points of acting and dressing like a gentleman. But Edward, for all his fancy clothes, was not much of a businessman. In 1908, he was fired from a sales job. He came home a completely broken man, said Scott, and he was a failure the rest of his days. This experience left a deep impression on young Scott, who resolved that he would never be a failure like his father. Fortunately, his mother, Molly Fitzgerald, came from an affluent St. Paul family, so the Fitzgeralds were never quite destitute. Molly would borrow money from her relatives to send Scott to all the right prep schools. But as a poor boy amongst a lot of rich classmates, young Scott always felt like an outsider, until eventually he discovered that he had a special gift that would help him fit in.
He found it was easy for him to write poems and stories and plays where it was not easy for others, even very bright young children. He was aware of this gift early on, and then he used it to win acceptance.
All through prep school, Scott relished the attention he got from his classmates when his stories, like this murder mystery, appeared in the school paper. He also wrote plays and staged big productions.
He took the starring role and surrounded himself with people whom he wanted to be friends with. So, in the simplest and most direct way, he found that he could write the lines, and all of these people he knew would follow his script. It was like magic.
Young Francis Scott Fitzgerald had found a way to impress people and win social acceptance. From then on, there was no question. He would be a writer. In 1913, Fitzgerald was accepted at Princeton, an Ivy League college with a beautiful campus in New Jersey. Before he had even arrived, Scott worked out an elaborate fantasy. He would be a big man on campus, admired by all his classmates. Blinded by visions of glory, as soon as he got to Princeton, Scott tried out for the football team. But at just under 5'8" and 138 pounds, he was far too small and was cut the very first day of practice. Better, Scott decided, to stick with what he did best. So he wrote for the university's literary magazines and joined the Triangle Club, Princeton's most prestigious theatrical group. Just as he had as a boy, Fitzgerald used his writing skills to impress his peers. He wrote lyrics for the group's musical comedies and cast himself as the star. Since Princeton was an all-male school, it was expected that men play the female roles. but few looked as good dressed in drag as Scott did in this publicity photo, which caused quite a sensation when it appeared around campus. Fitzgerald was having a wonderful time, writing musicals and partying with friends. But even in college, Scott showed early signs of a drinking problem. His diary includes notes about getting so drunk he passed out at dinner. He spent more time writing plays than studying and was eventually placed on academic probation. But rather than buckle down and study, Scott went to a dance his sophomore year where he spotted a beautiful 16-year-old debutante.
Ginevra King was the top girl. She was the one all the boys wanted to dance to. The stag line, when she came by, would sway in anticipation, and one boy braver than the rest would go out and cut in. Fitzgerald was brave, and he set his cap for her.
Scott and Ginevra dated for a time and exchanged love letters. But Scott was supposedly told by Ginevra's father that poor boys don't marry rich girls, and she broke off the relationship.
She went on to someone more suitable to her social standing, but the story, which I think is probably true, is that till the day he died, he kept all the letters that she wrote to him wrapped up in a little package with a ribbon tied around it.
To Fitzgerald, Ginevra would always represent the kind of golden girl who appeared later in his novels. She was the one all the boys wanted, but could never fully possess. By junior year, Scott was failing so many classes he decided to withdraw from Princeton. As he wrote, there were to be no badges of pride, no medals after all. The young man who wanted so much to succeed had flunked out of school and failed at love. He was feeling pretty discouraged in 1917 when suddenly the United States entered World War I, and Fitzgerald happily headed off to boot camp and another chance at glory. In June 1918, as the war to end all wars raged in Europe, Second Lieutenant F. Scott Fitzgerald reported to Camp Sheridan in Montgomery, Alabama. Just as in college he had dreamed of being a big man, Scott now imagined himself a war hero. As he waited to be sent overseas, Scott attended a dance at a local country club, where he saw a young girl who, as he said, made everything inside him melt. He was looking at 17-year-old Zelda Sayre, the daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court judge, who often had that effect on men.
I don't think pictures of Zelda do her justice. I think she had an aura about her. I mean, that there was something about the way she dressed, something about the way she presented herself. The people who knew her all say that she was just a beautiful woman.
That something made Zelda one of the most sought-after belles in the South. As one rival recalled, when Zelda Sayre came to dances, the Birmingham girls just went on home. But though Zelda came from a prominent family, she was not your typical Southern belle. For as everyone in Montgomery knew, Zelda was wild. When she was 10, she telephoned the fire department to say a child was stranded on the Sayers' roof. Then she climbed up there and waited to be saved. At 17, she was already smoking, drinking, and driving men to distraction.
When Zelda was a young girl, she loved diving off high platforms into the water. She used to delight in outraging the expectations of their elders. Chaperones at dances, she'd go by them and flip her back skirts at them. And she was that kind of girl. She knew how to have fun, and she knew how to flout convention.
Scott had found his golden girl, the one all the other men wanted. I fell in love, he said, with her courage, her sincerity, and her flaming self-respect. Zelda, in turn, enjoyed the attentions of this dashing young